The Battle of Skull Island and the Michigan Mound Builders, Part 1, by Dennis M. Morrison Sr. Michigan's Saginaw Valley is rich in prehistoric remains and traditions. It has been extensively occupied by Native American cultures for thousands of years now. Some of the most fascinating accounts that have come down to us from ancient times are those of the often very bloody battles that took place. This is the story of one such battle, or series of conflicts, better known as the Battle of Skull Island. Please understand that the dates given here are speculative, but the facts that such a battle took place is not. It is said about the year 1520 the Chippewa Indians gained possession of the Saginaw Valley area, and that the Battle of Skull Island resulted in the near annihilation of the original landowners, who were the Sauk Indians. While few burial mounds remain in the area today, at one time mounds filled with human remains and artifacts could be found on nearly all tributary rivers and streams. William McCormick, writing in the 1830s, remarked on the abundance of earthen mounds. He wrote, "I have opened a few for my own satisfaction and found the human remains laying in all directions, showing that they were thrown together without any regularity, upon which I became satisfied that these Indians were killed in battle." McCormick assumed the haphazard arrangement of the bodies indicated that they were hastily placed in these hill-like graves. As a rule, great care was taken in the placement of the dead. When there was a great battle with many dead, there was a hurry to bury the bodies before decay could set in. The report continued. In 1834, I found a very old Indian man, and I asked him his age. He said that he thought he was a great deal over 100 years old. Still, he was as bright as a man in his 50s. I asked him about the mounds and the battles, and he said that he could tell me about them as they were handed down to him from his grandfather, who was very old when he shared them. The old Indian's name was Putasamani. With a wizened face etched deeply by many years of exposure to the elements, Putasamani shared the following. The Sauks occupied the whole of the Saginaw River and its tributaries, extending from Lake Michigan on the west to Detroit on the east. The balance of Michigan was occupied by the Potawatomi, and Lake Superior country was occupied by the Chippewa and the Ottawa. The Menominees were at the head of Green Bay in Wisconsin. The main village of the Sauks stood on the west side of the Saginaw River. The Sauks were always at war, being a very aggressive people. At last a council was called consisting of the Chippewa, Potawatomi, Menominee, and Ottawa, and 6 nations of New York. They all met on the island of Mackinac, with a great place to lay their war plans, and asked for the blessing of Gitche-Manitou, the Great Spirit's earthly home according to the Algonquin mythology. The island is called the Great Turtle, owing to its strong resemblance to a turtle lying in the water. The report continued. At Mackinac Island, they fitted out a large army and started in birch bark canoes, and came down the west shore of Lake Huron during the day until they arrived at a place called Petobegong, about 10 miles from the mouth of Saginaw River, where they arrived at night. In the morning, both armies started up the river, one on each side, so as to attack both villages at once. The army on the west side of the river made a surprise attack on the main village and massacred nearly all. The balance retreated across the river to another village. Then the armies that landed on the east side of the river came up, and a desperate battle ensued on a high piece of land where they attempted to fortify themselves by digging into the hill. Here the Sauk were again defeated. They then crossed the river and retreated to Skull Island, where they considered themselves to be safe. However, the next night after their retreat to the island, the ice froze thick enough for all the Allied warriors to cross, which they did, and another massacre ensued. Here the Sauks were exterminated with the exception of 12 families. Since that time, the island has been known as Skull Island due to the large number of skulls found there in the many years after the battle. The Allied warriors then divided, some going up the Cass River, some up the Flint River, and others to the Shiawassee, Tittabawassee, and so on, where different bands were located. The largest battles were fought on a bluff on the Flint River. A reinforcement from Detroit met up with the Allied braves here. They came down the river and fought one another battle on the bluff about a mile from what is now Flushing. This alliance was determined at all costs to wipe out the warring Sauk and claim their territory as their own. It was a plan of great magnitude and requiring careful planning. According to Pasamani's account, there was yet another battle 18 miles from Flushing, with many casualties on both sides. One confrontation took place at Bridgeport on the banks of the Cass River. There was located here a large mound known as Beacon Hill. The mound no longer exists as it was destroyed in the 1890s when the electric railway coming through Bridgeport used the sand, artifacts, and human remains as ballast for their railroad tracks. However, there is a written account of that great battle in the form of a poem written by Burton Andrus in the 1830s. His poem was based on accounts that he was able to gather from local Indians. Following is Mr. Andrus's poetic description, the Battle of Beacon Hill. Did Okanora fight and fall on Beacon Hill, and is that all? Nor said of them what time or where, who made their mausoleum there. 'Twas midnight, and the watch was set, the guard a watchful vigil kept. The fire had died, the night was chill, the moon had set, and all was still. For stands around, their shadows deep, thrown over the hill, all seemed asleep. The watch stood by, the night was dark, the beacon embers, only a spark. The midnight there, all dark and still, with beacon fires round the hill, the watch his war whoops fiercely cries, 3 arrows pierce him, and he dies. In light around, without a screen, the Huron braves were plainly seen, and from out rude forms there quick arose, and 2,000 braves rushed on their foes. The Hurons and the Tawas scream, the spears and knives and axes gleam. All night the conflict rages, with hundreds dead, and woundeds shrieks. The Tawas fled, to boats they run, the Hurons in the stream they plunge. The spearmen strike, and in the waves 2,000 Hurons found their graves. The remnant on the southern bank pursued their foe in broken ranks, who fled with many scars and fears, and never came back for many years. The oldest braves still will say 2,000 Hurons fell that day. They lost their old Chief Gray, the eagle of the northern bay. After these devastating series of attacks by the Allied tribes against the Sauk were pretty much exterminated except for the 12 families that I mentioned previously. A council of the Allies was held to decide what was to be done with those remaining. Some were kept for torturing and killing. Still others were spared for some reason. Finally, the Allies agreed that they should be sent west of the Mississippi, and arrangements were made with the Sioux to protect the Sauk, that the Sauk would not be harmed. The Sioux would be responsible for their protection. The conquered area, including the Saginaw Valley, was divided among the Allies as a common hunting ground. However, there were a few problems with that. It was not uncommon for hunters to enter the area and never be heard from again. The Indians, being somewhat superstitious, believed this was caused by the spirits of the killed Sauk, who were seeking revenge for their being butchered. What had in fact happened is that a few Sauk had escaped the attacks and were killing the hunters in retribution for their own stunning losses. The following is again from William McCormick's account. Tundugong, an Indian who died in the 1840s, told me that he had killed a Sauk while hunting when he was a boy, and that had been over 80 years ago. And up to a few years ago, the Indians still believed there were Sauk in the area. They had claimed to see the places where they had made fire and slept. I have known them to get together and not hunt for several days for this very reason. I used to laugh at them, but it was to no avail, as you could not make them believe otherwise. The great conquered hunting land was considered haunted, and very few Indians came there to hunt, even though the game was very abundant. Finally, it was used as what might be termed a penal colony. Every Indian that committed a crime would flee or be banished to the haunted hunting ground in Saginaw Valley to escape punishment. The Chippewa became the most numerous. Finally, their language predominated, and at present time the Indians in Saginaw Valley do not speak the same in all respects as the Chippewa in Lake Superior, from which they originally sprang. This showed the mixture in Saginaw of the varied allied nations. The Battle of Skull Island and the Michigan Mound Builders, Part 2. In Part 1 we took a look at the great battle which took place in the Saginaw Valley, a war that brought together many different Native American nations as allies to defeat a common enemy. This was based on the very old writings of William McCormick. Those same documents also contained a great deal of information on the burial mounds that Mr. McCormick encountered throughout the Saginaw Valley. Most of these edifices are gone, destroyed by the farmer's plow, making such written accounts as follows here even more historically significant. Mr. McCormick also left a fascinating account of some of the mounds in another old handwritten document. He recorded, "In the wanderings of the mound builders, this peninsula was not overlooked. Here are many evidences of their coming and their staying." My father immigrated with me to the Saginaw Valley in 1832. My associations were mostly with the Indians, whose language I became very familiar with. For several years I was engaged in the fur trade, during which time my business was to go up several tributaries of the Saginaw River to buy furs from the Indians, and on nearly all occasions I found indications that the Saginaw River and its tributaries had been densely populated at some remote period by another race of people prior to the Indians. On a bank just below the city of Flint, there were 8 large mounds which I saw opened. They were from 20 to 40 feet in diameter and about 5 feet high. When opened, they were all full of human bones, all of which were in a better state of preservation than any mounds I have examined. We found one shin bone with an arrow embedded in it and broken off, showing that it was part of the leg of a person killed in battle. We found no implements but some pieces of flint. The bones indicated a larger race of people than the present Indians. We now proceeded down the Flint River until we came to the high bluff 1 mile above the village of Flushing on the Bailey farm, where we examined mounds at that point which I shall designate as the Bailey mounds. I first saw these mounds in 1833 or 1834. At that time this farm was one dense forest land. I think there were about 20 mounds, both great and small, some 40 feet in diameter and 6 feet high, with pine trees growing on the top of them, as large as those in any part of the forest. We found in opening the largest one that it was full of bones. The skeletons did not appear to be arranged in any particular order, but appeared that the bodies had been thrown together before they were buried, indicating that they had been slain in battle. Such a haphazard arrangement of bodies would seem to indicate a hasty burial. It seems that most often the case was to give great care to the preparation of burials, particularly with the orientation of the bodies. In large battles, such as that related in Part 1, it would be necessary to quickly bury the dead to stop the onslaught of stink and disease. To continue, the bones were too badly decomposed to find any marks of violence on them. Subsequent events in the after years have confirmed my belief that this once populous race of Saginaw Valley had been exterminated by another race of people. From the Bailey Mounds, we were still excited to resume our exploration down the river. At several points, always in the elbow of the river, and always on the bluff where you could get a good view up and down the river, there would be 2 or 3 mounds, but not of so large dimension as those above until you reach a point about 12 miles below. There, contrary to the customs of the mound builder, you find on the east side of the river and on the flat nearly 100 graves, which tradition says are those of Indians, all of whom died in one day and night with sickness which the Great Spirit in his anger had sent among them. This must have been some epidemic, for we know that the Indians have had smallpox or other contagious diseases amongst them, and they all flocked together at such a time. In their tradition of this incident, they say it was their own nation that occupied these mounds and not the mound builders. Here then we might very well be the first record of a pandemic-type scenario to hit the Saginaw Valley. Flocking together as the people are reported to having done would certainly do nothing to stop the spread. Of course, it would in fact spread the illness much more rapidly. Some 10 miles further down the river, having seen only a few small mounds, we came to the old Indian fields, now the Ross farm, but formerly the residence of the old pioneer James McCormick. He wrote, "This land was given to them by the Indians. Here there were 4 large mounds together in the elbow of the river on the bluff, like the Flint and Bailey mounds. Several more lie on the flat below. The bones in these mounds were very much decomposed, especially those on the flatlands. When these bones were exposed, they crumbled to pieces. This was no doubt owing to the difference of soil, the ground being much lower and subject to flooding every spring. We plowed up in those mounds a great variety of stone implements which were carried off by curiosity seekers. This ends Mr. McCormick's fascinating account, which gives a rare glimpse back at cunning planning and implementation of a very bloody battle, as well as a first-hand look at the mysterious burial mounds that dotted the landscape of the Saginaw Valley, most of which have now been laid to waste. It is sad that we walk over these sites daily, and that the progression of human history has pretty much eradicated any trace of what happened or of what was there.